The question asked for me this week was whether or not the Bible can contradict itself. Um, Boy, that's a question that for me is easy to answer, but sometimes the answer is difficult for people to hear. In particular, people who feel as though the Bible's authority comes from its internal consistency, or what they might call its inerrancy. Um, Before I answer that question, it's important to recognize that the Bible was not written by one author. The Bible was written by numerous authors. We don't even know how many. It wasn't until a much later date that it was all compiled into what we now call the Bible. It was written over hundreds, even 1,000 years. It was not all written down right as it occurred. I mean, these stories that are in Scripture were told through oral tradition for many, many years, many generations before somebody finally got around to writing them down. Um, and so what that means is that these documents are not all written at the same place and the same time. And so they were written in different contexts, expressing different experiences. And stop for a moment and consider the different context that you live in, even compared to your parents, and how you see and understand God and the world differently, maybe even than your parents did, certainly than your grandparents did. Um, and that's important to understand, because if we assume that the Bible is all written by one voice, then we can kind of assume that it is internally consistent. But there are numerous examples of the Bible not being internally consistent. The genealogy of Jesus isn't consistent with the rest of Scripture. There are places, for example, in Joel 3, Joel writes, you should turn your plowshares into swords. And in Isaiah 2, Isaiah writes that you should turn your swords into plowshares. Um, and so the question of whether or not the Bible can contradict itself, there's evidence right there in the text that it does. The real question is, does that necessarily mean or call the questions of the Bible's authority into question? Um, and for some people, the answer to that is yes, it does. And in order for the Bible to be authoritative, it has to be internally consistent. I disagree. I don't think that the authority of Scripture is dependent upon its internal consistency. I think that the authors of Scripture were writing to specific people in a specific time about specific things, and because of that, we must understand why they were writing and to whom they were writing and about what they were writing, in order to be able to really understand what was intended. And only then can we really be able to pull that into the 21st century to understand what it might mean in our own context. The authority of Scripture isn't dependent upon its ability to conform to history or tell us about science or be internally consistent. The authority of Scripture is in the fact that we believe that this is the story of God and the story of God's people, and that it has something for us in the 21st century. I can say that because I don't need Scripture to be able to conform to my understanding of history or science or consistency or anything like that. The authority of Scripture isn't dependent upon any framework that I can lay over the top of it. The authority of Scripture, in my estimation, is due to the fact that Scripture is something that God uses to teach us and to help us understand God's history in the world and how we can be a part of that history and a part of that story. And so that's the way that I choose to look at Scripture. I know next week there's another question about Scripture and how we live with it in the 21st century in spite of the fact that it's so many years old. So join me next week and we'll discuss that.